Hello, and thank you for joining the Talking Animals Law and Philosophy series. This is the third event in Lent term. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Raphael Fazel. I'm the co-director of the Cambridge Centre for Animal Rights Law. Just a few words about how these events work. We will start after my introduction with a presentation by our speaker that will last somewhere between 30 and 45 minutes. After that presentation, we will move to a Q&A, and everyone can come in with comments, with questions in the Q&A. I usually encourage people to use their virtual raise hand so they can actually ask their questions or make their comments directly. It makes for a much nicer discussion, but you can also use the chat function if you prefer. I will have everyone's mics muted, except of course the speakers, until we actually reach the Q&A part. We are recording this event, so if you'd like to watch it later, if you're gonna perhaps miss a section or want to share it, you'll find it on our website and YouTube channel in about a week's time or so. Excellent. I think that's all as far as housekeeping goes. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our wonderful speaker, and that's Victoria Kühborth. Victoria Kühborth is a research assistant and PhD candidate in law at the University of Freiburg in Germany. And most importantly, she is currently a visiting researcher at our center here. Victoria's doctoral research focuses on the enforcement of EU farmed animal protection laws. Her work offers critical insights into the enforcement of these laws on different legal levels, domestic, international, regional, and it also proposes some pathways for reform. In her research that she is conducting here at our center, she looks at the role of trust in animals and how focusing on trust can help us reframe and address the manifold ways in which current laws fail animals. And in her presentation today, indeed, she will be telling us more about this research. So, Victoria, thank you for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Raphael. Thank you so much for this really kind introduction. I will just share my screen with you. Hope it works. I think you should see it now.
Yes.
Perfect. So again, thank you so much, Raphael, for this really nice introduction. And I just wanted to highlight and really express my sincere gratitude that I can present today and also be part of the center in general since January and until March. And I'm incredibly grateful for all your support from the center support and for all your feedback that I've already received. So thank you so much. And I couldn't do the research without it. So I'm really grateful. And like as Raphael said, today's topic is on a new way of viewing the relationship between humans and animals from a trust point of view. And the presentation is called A Legal System Worth the Animal's Trust. So I will focus on the legal implications that a trust-based animal-human relationship would have. And in order to bring you into the topic, I would like to start with Fine, which is the parents with whom the cat with whom my parents live since quite a while. And on this picture, you can see her peacefully snoozing on my legs while I'm on the couch. And you might think that she is trusting me to not get up within the next few minutes so she can rest in her relaxed position. And there are several other instances where you can think or feel that the animal is actually placing trust in you or withdrawing the trust from you. Like when my dad, like one of her prime humans she relates to, is gone and he returns. Upon return, she doesn't even look at him. She barely greets him because she's so upset that he betrayed her trust that he's usually around. And when I talk to some of you about animals and trust, you also came up with other stories like a blind dog trusting the human caretaker to guide him around obstacles, or when you take the animal to the vet and they're really anxious and nervous because they're not used to the situation. So there are many instances where we can actually think about trust in animals, and I think this is really one strength about why trust as a center of a human-animal relationship is great, because it's a relatable, really well understandable concept in comparison to rather abstract approaches we know in animal law, like rights or citizenship. Trust is really a relatable one. And there are other really beneficial elements of trust, which are useful if you want to consider legal reforms. These include that trust is indeed a necessity for any sentient social being to survive. You cannot survive without trusting another being. It is also an inclusive approach, because without having any other capacity except sentience, you can trust. You don't need to express it verbally. You don't need to comprehend it. So it's a really inclusive concept, which then also includes animals. It's non-reciprocal, so trust does not need a relationship which is usually brought with rights, duties, and rights. No, it's unilateral. At least initially, you do not have to give anything except your trust in order to have it respected. So this is another beneficial aspect around the concept. The fifth one is continuity, that when we talk about trust, we rather focus on its maintenance and its restoration rather than the punishment of violation. So it's rather this continuous cycle of building and maintaining trust and restoring it eventually. And lastly, it's a concept focused on emotional value, on like psychological connection rather than physical connection between humans and animals, which is another approach apart from the approaches in animal law that we know. So there are many great benefits if you think about trust in animals and the relationship to humans. But you might wonder, why should I care about the trust of animals at all? Can they actually trust? Is this something scientific? Isn't it anthropomorphic? Because we apply a concept that we usually use with humans onto animals. Isn't it grotesque to talk about trust in an exploitative setting, as in factory farming or in laboratory settings? So there are many questions indeed, and I would like to address them as far as I can today. And I would start with the general question on why. Why should we care about the trust of the trust of animals at all? Then I will elaborate on how trust works, like what are the elements if we consider the 3 stages: establishing, maintaining, and restoring trust. And from this micro perspective, from the interspecies relationship between animals and humans, I would like to go further, one step further, up to the macro level, on what a legal system that is based on the trust of humans and animals, what it looks like, and it's in a specific criteria of such a system, and whether the current law system actually applies to these criteria that I will then develop. And last but not least, I would like to give an outlook on where the law should be headed, what a trust-based legal system could look like. So without further ado, I would start with the first questions: why we should care about an animal's trust. As I mentioned already, trust is a necessary tool for survival, interconnected with sentience, vulnerability, and dependency. And for those of you who are not necessarily familiar with animal law, I will start with a few short definitions to get us sorted and to get us on a common ground. So let's start with sentience. Any sentient being is a being that is able to feel and express emotions in some form. And the sentience is connected with vulnerability as well as dependency. So any sentient being is vulnerable, meaning it is susceptible to harm. When I hit you, it hurts you, or when I shout at you, although not hitting physically, it still might hurt you. So you are susceptible to harm, and you are as long as you're a social sentient being, so embedded in a social cooperative society, you are dependent, which means that you are dependent on or relying on external sources. And because a sentient being is essentially vulnerable and depending on others, at least as long as it's a social being, it does needs to depend on the trust, on having his trust or her trust respected by others. So trust is a necessity that can be derived from our sentience, vulnerability, and dependency. Trust can be defined as a psychological state comprising the intention to accept the vulnerability. That's why we come to the first one, based upon positive expectations of the intentions and actions of the other. So that's why it's so interconnected, especially with the vulnerability, because you accept the risk that the trust that you've given is going to be betrayed. So it is, although it's a necessity, it is a matter of choice. I may place my trust in you or not, or place it to someone else and not in you. Which this interconnectedness with vulnerability and dependency and sentience also means that it's not an anthropomorphic concept that we just apply to animals, but rather that it's really ingrained, innate in the existence of any social sentient being, which is the human and also many other animals. And from this interconnectedness and derivation, you can really draw at least 3 or 4 components of trust, which I brought to you in the first instance, but which I can now explain better. So the first one is that comprehension of trust is not needed. Trust is rather an embodied state that emerges through interaction. It is therefore accessible irrespective of cognitive capacities. So you do not need to verbalize it. You just act on it. Furthermore, because we are dependent, because sentient beings are dependent on others, and we are also interdependent, which means at some point in our lives we might depend on others. Whether it's being as being a child, we all have been child at some point. We were dependent then on parents, or when we're getting older, we might again be dependent on other people taking care of us. So there really is this notion of interdependency, and because we are so dependent on the actions of others, at some point we are responsible to not abuse the trust that we receive in order for our trust to be respected when we need it. So we do have the responsibility to not fail the trust of any sentient being, which includes wild or urban animals such as pigeons or mice, irrespective of their moral or legal status. But more importantly, if we're talking about the dependency between humans and animals that are working together closely, such as companion animals or animals in farmed settings or laboratory settings, it is this dependency that is willingly created where the responsibility to respect the trust is even more significant, even more highlighted. So it's not only towards the responsibility is not only towards the animals in wild or urban settings, but especially in those in domesticated settings. And especially in the latter case, in the domesticated setting, the non-reciprocal character trait of trust becomes visible, because it's first and foremost the receiver who has the responsibility to not fail the received trust, to then expect to be able to expect her trust to be respected at some point. So to summarize shortly, what we just learned, because I know it's a lot to deal with, especially if you have not entered the realm of scientific concepts and philosophical ones on trust. Trust is a necessity, but a matter of intention for any sentient being that lives in social cooperation due to its inherent vulnerability and dependency. That's the first one. Second one, comprehension or articulation of trust is not required. Third, due to the interdependency of sentient beings, it's a responsibility of any being to not fail the received trust. And this is particularly relevant in cases of artificially created dependency. And lastly, while in interdependent relations, trust is reciprocal, it commences unilaterally. So again, to sum it up, we should care about the trust of animals due to our inherent vulnerability and interdependency and consequential responsibility to not fail the trust they voluntarily or involuntarily place in us. So this is the first try to explain why we should care about the trust of animals. And if we agree on that, if we say yes, it is important, we might think, okay, how, if I accept that, how do I live up to the trust that the animal places in me? And here we can really take the insights we know from interpersonal, interspecies relationship onto the macro level, which we will do in the next step. First, we will start with looking at the different stages of a trust relationship, which is the maintenance, which is the establishment, maintenance, and restoration of trust. And because we cannot use any language with animals, because we either do not understand their language or they do not understand our language, any sort of affirmation, sincere apology, which we would usually refer to around trust, is not possible. We might ask ourselves, okay, what do we do then if we cannot express our trust in words? And I would like to use the cat of who's living with my parents, Fina, again, as an example to explore the elements of trust and the trust relationship. So picture her, but not as the cat you've seen earlier, but as a kitten. So she's a kitten coming from the shelter. We just adopted her, and she's really fearful. She's hiding somewhere in the corner in the house. To just not be touched or bothered at all. But I'm here. I want to have a relationship with her, a trustful relationship, and I might wonder, okay, what do I do in order to gain her trust? Trust essentially involves brain processes that are related to social attachment and rewards, as well as those to uncertainty and risk, if we also consider the definition again from the beginning. And sentient beings that live in social corporations are generally predisposed to attach in order to receive safety and care. Trusting someone is therefore the default option of a newly born being that is hardwired for survival. However, it is refined subconsciously through associative learning. So animals can learn and thus decide intentionally whether they how to act based on past interactions. This can also be seen, for example, if we picture the kitten again, when she's approaching slowly, sniffing, maybe doing some sort of behavior that indicates that she might have already learned from past interactions that you first look at someone closely before you place your trust. For me, if I want to gain her trust as a trust receiver, I slowly need to introduce myself, provide actions that are positively associated. I need to pay close attention to her nonverbal cues and essentially respect her outcome, the outcome of her choice, whether she now feels comfortable to expose her vulnerability. And whether it was a positive decision or not, you can actually again see it in the behavior, whether she's approaching and staying close, or whether she is exposing vulnerable body parts. And if you happen to be a scientist, you might have an instrument with you measuring the rise of oxytocin levels in her blood, which would also signal the building of trust. So as a recap, I would have to pay close attention to her nonverbal cues and respect her choice. So that's how we started. And now that I managed to get her trust and she accustomed herself to the new place and feels more comfortable, I wonder what I can do to maintain our trust relationship so she doesn't bite or hit me out of nowhere at some point in our relationship. This again highlights the continuity part of trust, because trust has to be maintained in order to slowly grow stronger over time to become self-sustaining at some point. For such maintenance, it's important to act consistently and predictable and positively reinforcing the relationship in accordance with the place trust that I gained. This would include patting or stroking instead of hitting, obviously, as well as moving slowly and speaking quietly to act in a predictable manner. And again, if you had your instrument with you, you could measure the lower heart rate and the diminishing level of cholesterols, as well as in increased interactions if you were looking at the behavior. So again, it's about the consistent, predictable, positively reinforcing manner that I approach her and that I respect her choices, whether she feels comfortable exposing her vulnerability. So after we maintained, established the trust, well, it might happen at some point that I need to restore the trust because I failed her at some point. For example, that when she's actually used to me coming home at a certain time, and then suddenly my routine changes and I'm gone, and she might feel betrayed because I didn't show up for weeks, for example, and then I come home and she doesn't look at me and doesn't want to be touched, etc. So what can I do to restore the trust, to gain it again? And here you can see that trust is really a delicate matter. It may take months or years to build, but it only moments to break, really. And while the building of trust is associated with positive emotions and a rise in oxytocin levels, the betrayal of trust is associated obviously with negative emotions such as distress, sadness or anger, and a rise in cortisol levels. And animals actually show patterns of avoidance if they learned to distrust. So here we are again with this associated learning where they learn whether to trust or not. And in order to regain her trust, obviously, I need to identify the cause. For example, that I changed my routines and take ownership if I can change my routine back to the one we had. I slowly need to reestablish this environment of safety and reintroduce my actions of positive reinforcement. But most importantly, you might have noticed it already in the other stages, but here in this restoring phase, it's really important that the animal is actually the one dictating the pace of interactions. So again, I would need to pay attention to her cues, respect her decisions, etc. So you can really see the elements already emerging from our interrelationship idea. That it's actually a dynamic cycle which should be visible from the arrows going in all one way. So it's a cycle. It's dynamic. And now that we've seen the interrelationship, this micro level, I was wondering, how can we put it to a macro level? How can we achieve a legal system that is worth the animal's trust? because all these elements seem pretty straightforward and common sense, and that people should actually act on accordingly. But we also know that millions of animals are currently suffering in our society, in the current legal system, and that their trust is obviously being betrayed, probably because humans prioritize their interests before animals' interests. So we do need some protection in order to have their trust protected. So how do we make the responsibility we already have stronger? And that's where the law comes in. We really need a system that directs actions and that has consequences when certain action that is required is violated or done. And such a trust-based legal system obviously should be informed by the elements that we've seen already. So it should be a system that creates a safe environment centered around the activeness, the active part of the animal. Starting with the establishing point, attentiveness, affirmation, and deference. So we have to have the capacity and competency to construe nonverbal signals of the animal. That's attentiveness. We need to act affirmative, so we have to show that we're not causing any harm, but rather the opposite, that we should be associated with positive actions, that we should act respectfully, respect their choice. If they don't feel comfortable, to leave them alone and wait until they are ready to trust again. Then when we're in the maintaining part of the trust relationship, we have to establish routines and routine actions to provide a sense of safety. We need to act predictable, so avoid sudden movements or actions that are out of the zone of expectation. And when we're talking about the restoration of trust, we need to be responsible, recognize our fallibility, that we did something wrong, and also act flexible. So we need to give way to the pace of the animal and adjust our demands to their demands. So these criteria, as I said, seem pretty straightforward, but they are probably worth nothing if we are talking about the usage of animals in a context that is exploitative, such as intensive farm systems, where the animal has no choice but to trust the person taking care of the animal. And the first answer to such a practice in a trust-based legal system would obviously be such a practice is illegal. We don't allow such practices. So yes, it is grotesque to speak of trust of animals in exploitative situations. But I think this first initial reaction is it's correct, but it's too short, because we will interact with animals at some point, even if we make such practices that are exploitative illegal. So we still need a legal system that regulates the interaction of humans and animals, which should be formed with these criteria that are already just presented. Plus, it should be supplemented with rigorous enforcement, such as the monitoring of animals and their feces and behavior, as I highlighted, with these oxytocin levels, etc. And we could also monitor the internalization of the responsibility of the ethical one that I tried to explain in the first part of the presentation. And all this enforcement obviously has to happen through third parties who are not involved in the trust or not trust relationship. So having said that, you might wonder, well, okay, but how's the current legal system doing? Are we anywhere near these criteria? Because after all, if we are already there, we don't need to discuss reforms. So the question is whether the current system is centered around an active role of the animal, and that the objective is actually to achieve a safe environment for the exposing of its vulnerability, and whether it promotes human behavior that is respectfully engaging, consistent and reliable, responsible and flexible, and whether rigorous enforcement is in place. And some of you who might be familiar with the legal protection that is currently in place for animals might be shaking their heads or already laughing, saying, yeah, well, our current system is obviously not based on trust. But let's have a closer look. Maybe we overlook some aspects that are actually indicating some of the discussed elements. Regarding the substantive law, so the one that stipulates principles and whether certain actions or practices are allowed or forbidden, we might consider or come to the point that we can argue that we're anything but close to a trust-based relationship. For example, if we consider the general state of animals being objects or property, where we're in a system where a chicken or any kind of animal is equalized with a stone because they're both objects and can be handed over to someone paying some price or not. So they are property or objects. There are subjects to benevolence. Even if we're in a progressive legal system, such as in Latin American countries, animals are still considered as passive right holders. So there's nowhere near an active part of animals in the human-animal relationship. And the current laws we have that should regulate the usage of animals actually perpetuates the exploitation. It takes away their choice of freedom and forces them to expose their vulnerability. So on a substantive note, we're, as I said, nowhere near a trust-based legal system. And on the enforcement, on the procedural note, on the enforcement side, we all know, or we might know, that there is this gap, the so-called enforcement gap between the law that is written in the books and how it's actually applied in current society. And this is a graph you see on the right from my PhD thesis, showing the number on the blue line, showing the number of farm businesses that should receive inspections in order to verify their compliance with EU farm animal protection laws. That's the blue line. And then on the bottom, on the gray line, you can see the number of farms that are actually receiving inspections. So it's a fraction of those that actually should be inspected. That's only 5% actually of the whole of the entire amount of farming businesses. And although it's only an aspect of the enforcement of laws, of animal protection laws, you can see the tendency that indeed we do not have anything like rigorous enforcement in the current animal law system. So yes, we do need reforms, definitely. And where should they go? Where should we be headed? And this is where my paradigm shift from the beginning comes in. I think we really need a shift from the human-centric system in which exploitative practices are illegal, towards an animal-centered system, the animal having a leading role, and a system which creates a safe environment in order to respect the trust that they give us. This would entail that freedom of choice, for example, to expose the vulnerability is secured and protected. This could happen through a right, an animal right. As I already said, it would render exploitative practices illegal. However, we could discuss whether any use of animals, like shearing a sheep or milking a cow, would also betray their trust, or whether that would still be okay with them. Then when we're talking about general interactions between humans and animals, as I said, they should be regulated according to the elements that I pointed out, and monitored, rigorously monitored. And I think actually if we would have a legal system which focuses on the trust relationship between animals and humans, it would actually be easier to monitor. instead of the welfare codes we currently have that stipulate some specific space requirements that nobody can monitor because there's no time or resource to do so. And the laws are really vague, stipulating that unnecessary suffering should be prohibited. So the laws are definitely not adequate. And I think that a trust-based legal system would be doing better than that. And if we're talking about the monitoring, we know that it's actually already possible to monitor the physis of an animal, for example, through sensors that can be applied directly to the animal or through CCTVs, in which the recordings could actually show how the animal is reacting to a human approaching. And such a monitoring system could actually have a preventive function, because as I highlighted, the trust or expressing trust is a rather psychological one. So if we already see that the animal is not expressing any trust, we could already intervene before any physical harm is happening. So I think this preventive function is also a really beneficial one if we would be talking about reforms. So yes, I think a trust-based legal system is possible. It requires a lot and drastic changes, but if we would like the law to be headed there, I think it's a promising pathway. And to wrap this up, what should you take away from today's Talking Animal series? First point, the humans and animals, indeed any sentient being that is vulnerable and interdependent, have the responsibility to live up to the trust of each other. Trust refers to the decision to expose one's vulnerability and to accept the risk of betrayal. Furthermore, to live up to the trust that is placed in us, we have to be attentive, respectful, flexible, act consistently, and take responsibility. Moreover, a trust-based legal system is centered around the creation of a safe environment in which sentient beings can decide whether they feel comfortable enough to expose their vulnerability. This entails, as mentioned already, respectfully engaging beings that act consistently and reliable, take responsibility, and allow flexibility. And to protect such an environment, rigorous enforcement would be needed or is needed. The current animal law or animal legal system is the opposite. It does not acknowledge animals as active leaders in human-animal interaction, nor is it being rigorously enforced. Therefore, a paradigm shift is needed. A trust-based legal system should ensure the animal's freedom of choice, whom to trust, rendering exploitative practices illegal. Laws protecting their choice should be simplified, replacing centimeter measurements and vague terms. And due to the possibility of monitoring an animal's reaction to its handling, at least physical harm could be prevented. So lastly, I would like to emphasize that a trust-based legal system would not only imply huge improvements for animals, but for society as a whole, because respectfully engaged citizens are most needed in an increasingly polarized world that we're currently facing. So I highly recommend thinking about such a system, and I'm happy to discuss. Thank you for your attention. I'm looking forward to all your questions, answers, comments. And if you would like to connect, this is a QR code to my LinkedIn profile. Thank you.